Hey, fantastic. I can see people are starting to pile in. We'll just let everyone have a chance to get into the webinar before we start officially today, but welcome everyone. Okay, awesome. So it looks like we're getting pretty stable at 30 people. So if you're ready to go, Shelley, I think we can start.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll start off with a little bit of an introduction before we get right into the webinar. So I'd like to welcome everyone. Hello. I'd like to welcome all to our webinar today. My name is Alex. I'm one of the engagement coordinators here at the Invasive Species Council of BC. Before we get any further, I would just like to mention that this webinar will be recorded to be shared later. All right, so I would just like to acknowledge that we are all tuning in from many different parts of the province, from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of many different bands and nations. Personally, I'm joining you all from Edmonton, Alberta on Treaty 6 land, where I'm very thankful to the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Sioux, and Métis who have lived on and stewarded the land since time immemorial. I'd love to hear where you're all joining us from today, so please feel free to introduce yourself and where you're calling in from in the chat. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A function and we will try to get to as many questions as possible after the guest speaker presentation. So as you're all putting in where you're from, I would just like to go over the ISCBC's mission statement. Our mission is to take action to build healthy landscapes, habitats, and communities through education and responsible practices to prevent the spread of invasive species. And lastly, I would just like to acknowledge the ISCBC's affiliate network. ISCBC's affiliate network brings together regional independent organizations working to build and provide a strong collective voice for BC, calling for increased action on invasive species. So, before I introduce today's guest speaker, Shelley Humphries, I wanted to note that May is Invasive Species Action Month in British Columbia, a month-long campaign that generates awareness and engages people in the province on invasive species and their impacts. All the details on this month's events, including information on upcoming webinars, can be found on our website, bcinvasive.ca. And now, without further ado, it's time for us to get into today's presentation, Parks Canada's response to the detection of whirling disease parasite in Yoho National Park. We are joined today by Shelley Humphries, who is stepping in for our original presenter, Marie Villard. Shelley has been the aquatic specialist for Lake Louise, Yoho and Kootenay field unit with Parks Canada since 2005 and is responsible for fish and water. Shelley has been a part of the initial response team when Parks Canada detected whirling disease in Banff in 2016, and she works closely with the AIS prevention and monitoring team with Marie. So without further ado, thank you for joining us today, Shelley.
Thanks, Alex. Good morning or afternoon for everybody, depending on where you are. I'm Shelley Humphries. I'm the Aquatic Specialist for Lake Louise, Yoho and Kootenay. Marie was going to give this presentation, but she's had a personal emergency come up, so she asked me this morning to take over. I'm good to take over. I've been living, eating, and breathing this for since 2016, and Marie and I work closely together. So hopefully I won't deliver these slides as elegantly as Marie because she designed them, but we definitely will make sure that you guys get all the facts off of this. So this presentation is Parks Canada's response to the detection of the whirling disease parasite in Yoho National Park. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our aquatic invasive species program, which Marie leads for the park, and then our response to the whirling disease detection in Yoho National Park last year, what happened last year and what we're planning to do this year. So Marie is always really good about saying the things she's going to tell you about and then come back and tell you, make sure we did it at the end. So these are the 5 things we're going to talk about today. 1, what are invasive species? Most of you guys know this already. You could go to the second slide, Alex. 2, what is whirling disease specifically? This is a new thing for British Columbia, so not everybody might be aware of this. 3, what do visitors need to know in Yoho and Kootenay who are coming to visit this summer? 4, what are we doing to prevent aquatic invasive species, or AIS, in Banff National Park? And then 5, how do you report potential aquatic invasive species? Next slide, please. So most of you know or have been exposed to this already based on the organization or what you do in the scope of your work. But here are some of the most common AIS species that we're thinking about and dealing with right now. Generally speaking, there's some kind of non-native plant, animal, or disease. It's probably come from someplace else. And so the natural control mechanisms in the ecosystem aren't there. They're known to be able to cause huge environmental, economic, or cultural damage. And they're commonly moved to new locations by humans. And unfortunately, there aren't always ways to treat them after they have come to your location. And unfortunately for us, they're often transported on watercraft or gear. Often they've got small microscopic parts of their life stage that are easily misdetection. Next slide, please. Okay, I've got two figures here, so I want to focus first on the left. This image is from last year. We went and we looked back over all the permits that Parks Canada received in the mountain parks. And we created this heat map so that you can see where we can see where all of the people who came to either angle or use personal watercraft inside the park had come from. And you can see that we have international travel from all around the world. And the darker, the more yellow, the more red the colors are, the more people came from that location. And we've got people routinely visiting us from locations that are known to be whirling disease positive or also have mussels. And I think maybe some people felt like our response has been a little bit outsized, but this map on the right shows you that the mountain national parks are sitting at part of the hydrological apex of Canada. We are responsible. Water starts in the park and goes into 3 of the 5 major watersheds that we have in the country. And a lot of these AIS are easily transported with downstream movement of water. So if we get it, there's a good chance that it's going to flow downstream and infect the people below us. So unfortunately, we've had to take some pretty strong action. Next slide, please. So for those of you that haven't been introduced to whirling disease before, I'm going to give you the Coles Notes life cycle. Always have to have a life cycle if there's a parasite. And I'm going to start between 1 and 5 where the purple spores are. So it's kind of a crazy thing, this whirling disease. It's actually a cnidarian, so it's like a freshwater jellyfish. It's from Europe. And it has a very complicated parasite life cycle. It involves 2 hosts. It requires a salmonid, and it also requires a certain type of worm to be in the habitat. So these spores, the purple ones, are highly resistant. They can live for a long time out of water. They're in the mud. They can be in the water. They're completely microscopic, and they're easily transmitted by people. And once they get into the new environment, if the tubifex worms are present, the tubifex suck them up. And then once they're sucked up, they will incubate inside the worm for a while. And then when the water temperature conditions are right, the little worms will start ejecting these TAMs. And people call them TAMs because they have a really complicated name, but it's the triactinonomixon. So that's the TAM stage. I kind of think of them as like grapple hooks or like ninja stars or something like that. And they are like semi-buoyant. They're floating around in the water column, and somehow they're able to detect the presence of the salmonid fish, and they attack them. They stick onto them, and then they're able to move through the cartilage. So juvenile fish are absolutely the most susceptible, especially during the first 9 weeks, because they're still their cartilage is soft. It hasn't ossified yet, and it's easy for the TAM to infect them. And then one of 2 things happens. So the one little cycle is showing you that the juvenile fish just gets infected so badly from the initial infection that it just dies. And as soon as it dies, it is also capable, the parasites inside of it, of releasing a new round of these resistant purple spores into the ecosystem. The other thing that can happen, some salmonids are not quite as susceptible. They're able, or they're older, and they're able to survive the initial infection. And they can then show all these clinical signs. They can live in the ecosystem for some amount of time, and then when they die, they give off the purple spores, and then the life cycle is continued. So on the right-hand side, when we first get the parasite, it can be low severity. It's difficult to detect it. You have to sample a lot of fish to detect it. It can be found in all the different age classes. When you start to get moderate severity is when you start to see the clinical signs and the juvenile fish are starting to die and not be present in the ecosystem, and the less susceptible species are starting to get it. And then finally, when you have a high severity situation, we don't get recruitment. So those juvenile fish aren't able to recruit. They just die in their first year. We don't get H2, H3, H4 fish, but we still can have some adults in the ecosystem. And so sometimes it's really hard for people to recognize that there's a problem because they're still catching fish, they're seeing fish. And what they can't see is that hasn't been any recruitment. And these figures are actually from a Government of Alberta report that was done on the Crow's Nest River. And they believe that the Crow's Nest has high severity and that we're in the situation in the bottom where they're not seeing recruitment of fish into the ecosystem. Next slide, please. So this slide shows you on the left what a healthy rainbow trout looks like in the top bar. And then in the bottom bar, a rainbow trout that is showing multiple clinical symptoms. Not every fish is going to show them. They're not all going to have them and all have the same severity. But we picked a bad case just to show you some of the things. This blackened tail or a bent spine is one of the classic symptoms. But if you look carefully, you can also see the opercula is foreshortened. It's because the cartilage was attacked before it hardened, and you can see some of the gill lamellae are exposed, and it also has a short snout. And when they start showing this clinical signs, they don't swim very well and they're not in very good shape, and it's easy for them to get eaten by other species. And some lab work was done in the US primarily, and it was mostly lab work to test the susceptibility across a bunch of different species. So I do want to be clear, this was done in the lab and we don't have the same data for the field, but nothing has led us to believe it's going to be massively different in wild fish. And there is a big range of susceptibility. So at the bottom, Arctic grayling and lake trout aren't susceptible. They're very resistant to it. I'm going to come back to lake trout later if I remember. And then we've got this scale up to highly susceptible. And the most susceptible species are rainbow trout or steelhead, cutthroat trout, and sockeye or kokanee. And then we've got West Slope cutthroat trout, brown trout, whitefish, and Chinook sitting underneath them. So if you're less susceptible, you just may not show all the clinical signs, or you may not have as many spores, or you don't get as sick, but you can definitely carry the disease. Next slide, please. So Whirling disease came into North America, I think in the mid-50s. It came into the eastern United States, and it slowly marched its way across the eastern United States into the central portions and then into the west. And when I first became the aquatic specialist, we had a little thing in our fishing brochure saying whirling disease, will we be next? They had it in Montana, and it was the 2000s, and Alberta started testing, and we didn't find it. And then people let their guard down a little bit. Some of the testing stopped. And then in 2016, a knowledgeable person with a sharp eye, an off-duty Parks Canada vet, noticed fish in Johnson Lake having that distinctive swimming behavior, the whirling. And so the fish were collected, they were sent away for testing, and indeed Johnson Lake had a big whirling disease infection. After that, the province of Alberta, Parks Canada, and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency worked super hard the summer and fall of 2016 to do widespread sampling throughout Alberta. And in the end, Alberta turns out to be quite infected, and all the major southern river systems have been declared as whirling disease positive. And so the red areas are showing you where they were. Unfortunately, in Alberta, one or two small private hatcheries ended up having infected fish. And as they sold those fish and they were stocked out, it was spread. There's also some locations where it's likely that it was like angler transfer as well, but it's pretty widespread in the province of Alberta now. Next slide, please. So when this happened in Banff, I think we had a pretty big response, and we made a lot of changes right away to help contain what we thought was going on. So whirling disease is easily spread through water, mud, dead fish or fish parts, and people's gear for fishing or recreating. So we made some changes related to all these different pathways. So we banned felt-soled wading boots. We made the angling catch and release so that people weren't inadvertently disposing of infected fish parts and transferring it to a new location. We started our AIS prevention permit program, and we closed our critical habitat for West Slope cutthroat trout to recreational and in-water activity. So those were some of our big changes that happened in 2016 and are still in place. Next slide, please. So we also continued to sample. We sampled extensively in Yoho and Kootenay, and everything was negative in 2016. We also had the odd report in the 2020s. Every time somebody sent us a picture of an infected fish, we went out and we did sampling. Other things can make those clinical signs that aren't whirling disease, so you need to test them. All our tests came back negative. Then we also went back around 2020, 2021, and we repeated all the locations that we had done in 2016 that hadn't been triggered by an observation, including in Kootenay, to keep an eye on things. And we had also implemented some research related to whirling disease in the Bow River system, and we had some sentinel cages out. So we've been watching for it. And these are all the samplings that went on. And if you look carefully, you can see Lake Louise, we've got a few pink dots. And those pink dots are whirling disease positive locations that are in Banff National Park. And unfortunately, it's less than a 10-minute drive from the 2016 closest spot over into Yoho National Park. And that one 2016 pink dot, the northernmost one, that was actually a small pond that had rainbow trout that were infected with whirling disease. And because it was so close to the boundary, we actually used a chemical called rotenone, and we removed all the fish from that lake just to decrease the closest source that was there. So let's go on to I think the next slide. Let's see what's on there. Oh, okay. Fast forward to 2023. And unfortunately, we had a knowledgeable staff person angling off duty, catching some fish at Emerald Lake. This is Emerald Lake. You can see how busy and beautiful it is with boats. And he noticed clinical signs in the fish. They had the operculum and the foreshortened snout. And he took some pictures. And so that triggered us to do some wild fish sampling again. And we also had this lake was ready to have eDNA early detection water filtering to happen as well. So that commenced as well. I'll take the next slide, please. And unfortunately, that first round of sampling that we did at Emerald Lake, we did detect a couple of fish in the outflow. So that little inset on the left side is showing you kind of a blow up of the Emerald Lake area, the Emerald River as it connects down to the Kicking Horse, and all the sampling that we did in there. And so the initial site was that pink dot up at the top, the 2023. We did tons of sampling. We picked up a couple of positives in here. And unfortunately, though, because this was a new infection in a new province, the CFIA wasn't just satisfied with the molecular testing that we were doing using PCR. They wanted a secondary confirmation test. So they wanted to be able to visualize spores inside of the fish cartilage. So we expanded our testing, and in the meantime, we did the eDNA, and the eDNA results came back and alerted us to a problem up at Wapta Lake. So when you go out to the main map, Wapta Lake is the one that's got the pink dot, and it's got the yellow circle around it as well. So you can see after we did all our sampling in the fall, we've got it in Wapta Lake, we've got it in the Kicking Horse River downstream, we've got a little bit at Emerald Lake, and unfortunately, it's also further down in the Kicking Horse River, and we did one sample at the park boundary, and we have it there. Still by October, the CFIA had not been able to visualize the spores. So although we've been talking to people about the molecular stuff, it still hadn't been confirmed. We went back to Wapta Lake, we broke through the ice, we got more fish, and this time they were able to visualize the spores. So this is in part why we feel like it's a fairly early infection. It takes time for those spores to form. I'll take the next slide, please. So just recently, I think it's 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency did the declaration, and I think this caught some people by surprise. They've declared the whole Columbia River watershed as infected, and then they've put the other two British Columbia watersheds as a buffer. And I think we just need to be really clear with people that just because the whole Columbia has been listed as infected does not mean that there is widespread infection. That is absolutely not the case at this point. The only confirmed location is in Yoho National Park, right now at the very top of the watershed. But unfortunately, water flows downstream and the whole Columbia is full of susceptible species. So it's likely to spread just by natural water movement anywhere it's able to find both parts of the life cycle. And this also, we don't want people to lose hope. First, like we don't want people making these micro spreading movements. We're definitely in a containment response phase for Yoho. We don't want it getting spread inadvertently to other places and having people quicken the spread of this and saltating it all around the province with their recreational activities. And the province and Parks Canada definitely plan to have movement controls within the infected area if we feel like that's what we need to do. Next slide, please. So part three, we're on part three. What do visitors in Yoho and Kootenay need to know? So this year, Yoho and Kootenay are having one type of response and Banff is having something different. So I'm going to talk about Yoho and Kootenay first. And this is a continuation of what happened last year. We're still in a containment and response phase in Yoho, and in Kootenay, we're in a prevention phase. And we are going to continue the prohibition of angling and personal watercraft for 2024. So we know that up to 90% of declines can be seen in some of these populations. And we really need the public to help us. So we need them to respect the closures that were put into place. Next slide, please. So if you're coming to visit this summer, I'm going to talk first about what is not allowed, which is on the left side of the slide. Watercraft. All watercrafts, every kind of watercraft, including things you buy at Canadian Tire that don't seem like watercraft, like donuts and unicorns, are not permitted. And motorized boats were never permitted in Yoho and Kootenay anyways, but you can't have motorized boats. And angling is also not allowed this year. And then what is allowed? You can still go swimming, and you can have beach and shoreline access. And if you need water access for land-based activities, for getting water so you can fill your kettle or your filter when you're backcountry camping, that's permitted. And then Emerald Lake also does offer boat rentals. So those boats stay there all the time. They never leave. So we don't really consider that a spread risk for that activity. And then people need to clean, drain, and dry as our prevention program. And that's what we're going to be continuing for Banff. So next slide, please. Just going to take a second to let you guys know that we are still continuing to monitor. I will be doing mostly 2 activities this year, probably 3. We're going to be collecting wild fish. Catching juvenile fish is a lot of work, but it's also, they're very sensitive to the infection. So that's the team electrofishing for small fish at Emerald Lake last year. This year, we are also going to be continuing with a sentinel cage. So in the right-hand side, you can see the sentinel cage that we had. I think that picture might be from Banff, but we're going to have it again in the Kootenay River near the McLeod Meadows campground. And that sentinel cage is going to have juvenile rainbow trout that are sterile that we've obtained from the hatchery, and they've already been tested to ensure the hatchery is disease-free. And they're going to be housed in there, and we're going to feed them and take care of them. And then every few weeks, we're going to go and we're going to sacrifice a sample of them, and we're going to send them away for analysis because those TAMs are amazing at detecting fish and finding them and getting hooked onto them. And so this is a really sensitive way to detect low prevalence situations in early detection. So we'll be having that happening. And already we've gone out to Kootenay. So we did test Kootenay last year. We did as much as we could. We collected 90 samples that were mostly taken in the middle of the park, kind of between Kootenay Crossing, Dolly Varden, and the Kootenay Vermilion confluence. Already this spring, before freshet started, we gathered more fish upstream of that on the Vermilion-Simpson confluence. And we've also collected some downstream where people are routinely putting in and taking out if they're rafting at the Kootenay River Dace area. Last year we collected 90 fish, and we'd really like to get up closer to 150 to 175 fish to know that we're detecting even as low as a 5% prevalence. So that work is going to be ongoing. Next slide, please. So here's what's happening in Banff. We still are continuing and focusing our effort and all of our resources and our inspectors into the Clean, Drain, Dry, and Certify program in Banff. So I think this is very similar to what everybody else is doing. You need to clean everything off. It needs to look clean. It's remarkable to me how many people show up, say they clean their boat and it's still dirty. It has to be completely drained. If some boats have like internal compartments, if you can't drain them, your boat's not getting permitted. And you have to really dry it out. We want them dried for 48 hours if you have come most recently from Alberta, BC, or the territories, but 30 days if you have come from someplace outside of that. And then if you meet all those conditions, you can certify your boat or your equipment with your own self-certification permit. Next slide, please. So the permit stations are located all over the place, and this is just a flow chart that shows exactly what we had before. So in Banff, motorized watercraft are allowed, but only in one spot. That's Lake Minnewanka. And those boats require a mandatory inspection. There's an inspection station there. If you are at other locations in Banff, you can do the self-certification. And if you don't meet that self-certification requirement, then you need to go to an inspection station. Next slide, please. These are what the self-certification permits look like. They are widely available. You can get them at the visitor center campgrounds. They're online, and there are little kiosks pictured on the right at most of the high use access nodes and trailheads in Banff that are leading to places where we know people water recreate. And the permit's two parts. It tells you what you need to do. You need to self-certify or attest, and half stays in the box, and you keep the other half with you. And if you don't meet the requirements, what happens after that? I'll take the next slide. We're going to have 2 stations running in the park, and so people can take their equipment to these locations and have them inspected. And there is, it's possible the inspectors will still deny you, depending on what your equipment is and how dirty it is and where you came from and what you were doing with it. Even their cleaning may not be enough, because we do also prefer to have the drying time. However, at the cleaning stations, they are able to use hot water. So if you have equipment that can withstand that, you might be good to go. And so there's one at Lake Louise, and it's at the overflow parking lot. It's on the Trans-Canada Highway before you get to the village of Lake Louise, and it's super well signed, so I don't think you'll miss it. And then there is also the station up at Lake Minnewanka at the eastern end of Banff National Park. Next slide, please. I just want to go back. Sorry, don't go back on the slides. I just want to say our 48-hour drying time in the park is mandatory, and I think some people feel that's excessive. The people that are visiting us, many of them, most of them, are in campgrounds. They're camping, they're tenting. They don't have the ability to have access to a proper cleaning location, or the ability to take care of drying their stuff. People are not here in Invermere. I can go stick my boat in my heated garage, and I can be confident that in 24 hours it's really going to be dry. But if I am camping at icy little Waterfowl Lakes campground in northern Banff, it's not going to be warm enough for my gear to be dry. So recognition that we're at the top of the watershed and the weather is a little inclement and a lot of people are using camping facilities is why we have these stricter requirements. So part 5, how do you report your potential AIS? And here is a crayfish that somebody brought me to Bow Lake and Banff National Park 2 years ago. We have an email address, so report to this email address. And really what we want is a description of the organism. If you have the opportunity to take a photo or video, we want that. And especially if you can georeference that location using GPS coordinates, we would love that. We get reports for Alberta. Alberta gets reports for us. I'm sure BC gets reports for us. We get reports for BC. We try to make sure that they all get sorted and end up at the right place. The crayfish was reported by an off-duty staff member who rightly recognized that this should not be there, and he took his video, and it still took us 1,200 person hours to catch it. Next slide, please. So here's the review slide. I think I told you what they are. You knew already. I talked to you a little bit about whirling disease. I talked about how we're handling Yoho and Kootenay this year, which are in containment and prevention mode. Then I talked about Banff because we've got it. It's widespread in the Bow River in the eastern part of the park, but it isn't everywhere yet. And we're going to focus all of our cleaning and certification to that side, and then how people can report their AIS. And I'll have the last slide. So we really need people to cooperate. I'm sure you guys have seen some of the media reports. We've been collecting these permits. We are getting people that are being willfully non-compliant, and we can't have that. This is really serious. And although we're talking mostly about whirling disease today, we don't want mussels. And so this is kind of our dress rehearsal. And it's clear the fact that we couldn't stop this from getting over the continental divide is that we need to strengthen our program, and we really need to double down against mussels. So I hope that I have given you the basics on this, and I am happy to answer questions that you guys have.
Thank you for that, Shelley. Yeah, like you said, we now have a few minutes for questions. If you have a question for Shelley, please type it into the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. I don't see any in the Q&A box yet, but I actually had a question myself. Do you know if there's any preventative measures being developed anywhere in the world, such as a vaccination?
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't heard of vaccination, Alex, but in Colorado, where they got very badly impacted by whirling disease, they've done a couple things. They went back to Europe, where rainbow trout had been taken in the late 1800s. And those rainbow trout had gotten infected with whirling disease, but they'd had 100 years to sort it out. And they have some resistant strains in the hatchery system in Europe now. They brought some of those fish. So sometimes you hear about them talking about the Hofer strain, and it's the Hofer fish from the Hofer hatchery, I think, that were resistant. And they started breeding them with the hatchery fish. And they're starting to see that it's working. So that's one thing that they have done in Colorado. Another thing, they also went to locations where the infection was really bad, and they looked for fish that had already started to develop some resistance. It took like 20 years for fish to start to express it. So that is also working. Unfortunately for us, those are rainbow trout. And we've got lots of places in BC where maybe those tools would work if we decided to adopt them. It wouldn't be Parks Canada. We don't have a hatchery, and we don't have rainbow trout naturally in the park. But those types of tools aren't available for cutthroat trout, which are a special concern in our part of BC and threatened in Banff. So it's definitely like, I think there's lots of tools and technology out there, but it's really, it's going to be money, probably a little bit.
Yeah, awesome. So we've got a few questions in the Q&A. If you don't mind, I'll start. Let's read them off for you if you'd like. Jen, I'd like to ask, will whirling disease spread naturally, and to what extent do you think?
Jenna, I think it's going to spread, and I have no idea what the extent is. I am sure there are some very smart people that could probably do some fancy GIS about like downstream flow movement and make some projections about how long and how fast and how far. It has to get to a place where the hosts are. So if it ends up landing in a spot where there's no worms, then it might not take hold. And what makes worms, or where do we find worms? Where there's sediment. So we need to be really careful with our sediment practices, which we already are, but I think we're all aware of times when there's been, unplanned sediment releases or whatever. But this is a very good reason for us to really double down on that kind of situation to try to minimize the habitat that's available.
Yeah, awesome. We also have a few people that want to ask a question directly. So if you're okay with that, I'd like to unmute Dave, who has his hand up.
Okay.
All right. Dave, you should be good to go if you just unmute yourself.
Hi there. Yeah, just was typing out a few of them there. And just if most of the major southern Alberta rivers are already declared to be infected, what percentage of those would be seen as already suffering major fish losses, similar to the crow's nest, which would be more of the minority, I would expect?
Dave, that is not a question that I have any information on, and that would definitely be a question for the province of Alberta. The crow's nest was the one that they put the most funding into, and they spent quite a bit of effort trying to sort out what was happening in the crow's nest, but that funding has ended, and I'm not sure what's happening. I'll tell you, in the park, uh, I am not monitoring the bow as carefully as I could be to see what's happening. Counting baby fish is very difficult. Counting adult fish is very difficult, especially in the park where they're pretty low density as it is. But it's definitely something Marie and I have been talking about for the Kootenay, is like, we need to probably go gather some baseline information, especially if the Kootenay continues to be negative, so that we can actually understand and document what's going to happen, if anything. And Dave, not everywhere has been terrible. That's the thing. People just don't understand. What we don't know as managers. I've talked to Idaho, and I've talked to Utah, and I've talked to Washington, I've talked to Montana and Colorado. Colorado, Montana, Utah, it's been bad. Not everywhere, but in some places, these where these 90% decline discussions are from. Idaho and Washington, not so bad. They don't know why. I don't know why. We don't know if we're going to be more like Crow's Nest Pass, Alberta. Alberta is much more like Colorado in terms of what's happening in the crow's nest and what they're seeing in the river, and how that lines up to similar monitoring in Colorado, or if we're going to be different. And I think it's too soon to say.
No, I appreciate that. I guess the other more major one that was going to take a little longer to type out was as for the spread of aquatic invasives. It's been on my radar for a bunch of years now. We're here in Golden, just directly downstream. We've been seeing more and more eastern brook trout populations invading into our waters, and many of which coming directly out of Emerald Lake itself. So our concerns include infected fish obviously are being allowed to leave the park boundaries and carrying the spores with them directly downstream. And it's been no real effort to contain the fish to be within the park boundaries. And even despite the whirling disease efforts, are also diluting bull trout genetics as well because of our hybridization.
Dave, you're preaching to the choir. I've been spending I don't have unlimited money, but we've started to remove non-native fish from some locations on the Banff side. The reason we started in Banff, although Golden is near and dear to your heart, bull trout and cutthroat trout have a higher conservation status in Alberta. And unfortunately, I am more likely to get funded for projects that are restoring fish that are threatened or endangered than I am for special concern. Having said that, this year, we think we're going to be getting close to wrapping up our first envelope of funding for Banff, and I'm proposing some projects to start in Kootenay this year. I agree that having a brook trout on the landscape is bad for bull trout and bad for West Slope cutthroat trout.
Our next question in the Q&A is from Robin Hooper. She'd like to ask, can you please share that oh wait, no, I bet. Sorry, the next one is, what is happening in the Crow's Nest River? Is there hope that fish will come back healthy?
Oh, it's in the province, and I haven't heard anything about what's happening in the Crow's Nest River. Unfortunately, it's in the province of Alberta. We don't have jurisdiction. The slides that we showed before Marie came to work for Parks Canada, she worked for Alberta, but part of her duties were to generate this report, and those images and the stuff that we've shared from the crow's nest, it's actually publicly available on an Alberta website. I'm not sure what's happening right now. That's work that Marie worked on in the crow's nest, ended, I think, in 2019. So what's going to happen? Well, in Colorado, in certain locations, rivers that used to be rainbow trout dominated are now brown trout dominated. And there's been a flip to non-susceptible species. So that is a pathway that can happen. So it's difficult to say. And I guess I should just go back and talk about lake trout for a minute, because I told you I was going to. I was not monitoring Wapta Lake and Yoho National Park. Even though Wapta Lake is the closest lake to Banff, it is also almost fully dominated by lake trout, which are not susceptible. And so as we were developing our monitoring plans, nobody ever told me they thought they saw sick fish. All the time we'd been there, we'd netted them, all sorts of stuff. We'd never seen a sick lake trout. But we're starting to implement this eDNA, and it's a multi-panel DNA. It's looking for whirling disease, but it's also looking for mussels and everything else. And so when we were talking about, which lakes we could only afford like 10, which ones are we going to screen? We're like, let's toss Wapta on there. And we were very surprised to see it come back positive for whirling disease. And although it is lake trout dominated, as soon as you get out of the lake, there are brook trout in it, in the stream, and the brook trout have like 85% prevalence. It's not in the lake trout. So they're on the margins of that lake. If they go below, like they just get eaten by the lake trout, you don't catch them in the lake, but as soon as you step into the outlet, you find them. And so we could end up in situations where we end up with non-susceptible species dominating, unfortunately.
Okay. I'd just like to mention that we have hit 12:45, which is when we are scheduled to end. If you're okay to answer more questions, I'm sure we'd all love to ask more questions, Shelley, but I do want to mention that if you're available, our friends at the Columbia Shuswap Invasive Species Society are hosting a regional discussion on whirling disease in just about 15 minutes. Yeah, it'll cover regional outreach and prevention and best practices. So if you'd like to enjoy, there will also be an update from provincial staff from the Ministry of Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship. So it'll begin at 1 o'clock, and we will put the link in the chat for everyone to register as well. I just wanted to mention. But if you're okay to answer a few more questions, we have plenty more.
Alex, absolutely. You've got me today. Let's go with it.
Okay. So the next one we have from John is, where are the worms? Are they found right up to the glacier?
Oh, John, that's a really good question. We haven't done very much worm sampling. I haven't. They're pretty hard to filter, and there's 4 or 5 different lineages of them, and only 1 or 2 of them are susceptible to carry them. But we're definitely finding them in the Bow River, in the vicinity of Lake Louise, and upstream all the way by Mosquito Creek. So I wouldn't say we're right at the toe of the glacier. We're in a bigger river. But I think any place you've got like suitable sediment, they're a natural part of that ecosystem, and they're definitely there. And if you wanted to do a master's, you could come. We've the province and Parks Canada spent some time looking at suitable habitats, doing like a GIS exercise. They don't like it super steep. Like if it's a very steep stream, it's not holding sediment, and so they're not so likely to be there. But once you get to these valley bottom rivers, or if you get step pooly things that have got pools that are collecting sediment, I think it's possible to find them.
We have 2 questions in the chat which are relatively related, so I think I'm going to ask them both at the same time. The first one is, how do you treat your equipment internally, bleach or other solutions? But another person is asking, why are cleaning stations not using a quat solution, which is the most proven agent according to CFIA?
I will start by, well, I'll answer both of them. In my work unit, I do not use quat. I do not use quat because quat is full of ammonia, and the wastewater treatment plant in Yoho, they have told me in no uncertain terms that they can't handle that amount of loading from it. And so we would have to get a neutralization agent that we would have to add first to flocculate it and then use it. So for us, it does not work. And I think if you had a septic field on your property or something like that, I think the quat could also take out your septic field. So we use bleach. So you wanted to know what I do? We use bleach. We use freshly opened bleach because if the bleach is sitting around in the bottle, it starts to break down. And if anybody's deciding to use bleach, go for it. Wear glasses. It is caustic, and be careful when you're breathing it in because it definitely gives off vapors, and some people are very sensitive to it, and some people develop sensitivity to it from being exposed to it. The nice thing about the bleach is if you just leave your bleach container sitting out, by the next morning, the chlorine will have off-gassed, and so it's kind of just water after that. And you can also easily obtain like tablets to dechlorinate it that you can get to like make your tap water good for your goldfish. And we can get it in industrial amounts. They have to use it at the pool. If they have to like drain the pool, they have to dechlorinate it. So we usually just leave it out in the sun. And then we have a place where we can put it out where there's just gravel. We've kind of created a spot at work where we can do decontamination. So for my gear at work, we do not use the same equipment in multiple water bodies. We switch gear completely, new waders, new boots, new sampling equipment, whatever we've got going on. And so some days we don't have gear that's available if we've got a big campaign. So we have to plan our work really well. And we also, so then when we bring it back to the office, we follow the protocols that are online and that we give to researchers. We make not concentrated, but we make a bleach solution. We're careful. We measure what the concentration is. Everything is scrubbed vigorously and carefully with hot water to remove all visible mud, dirt, everything. Then it soaks in the bleach solution. We got a timer, then we take it out, we rinse it. And then after that, we hang it. And we've got an outdoor area where there's also like sunlight UV, and we tag things so we know how long it's been there. It'll go out and then it'll come back inside after it's had its 48 hours. My personal equipment at home, I live in BC. Nobody's telling me what to do. I treat my personal equipment. I love to fish and boat, and I've got 7 of these little boats. I treat it like that. If I use it day one, I go through all the same cleaning protocol at home and I hang it, and I don't use the same waders. I've got more than one pair of waders. I've got cheap little Crocs that I wear that are easy to clean, and do that, and just keep changing my equipment and making sure that I'm not ever using something that's moist or dirty. Did I get them all? The cleaning stations, why aren't they using quat? Well, it's pretty difficult. We have to manage it. It can't be ground dispersed. And so, I think also we have a shared responsibility. I'll tell you right now, our funding is going to end fairly shortly. We've got a special grant that we've been dealing with, and we're going to have a hard time affording the level of inspectors and inspections that we have right now without even moving to like taking responsibility for scrubbing everybody's boat with quat. I think people are going to need to take some personal responsibility for what they're doing. And days of jumping from water body to water body in a boat, your stand-up paddleboard or your pack raft or whatever, they're probably over. It's not safe to do that anymore. So bring them in clean, certify them, take care of them properly, and use to your heart's content in one water body for the weekend, but you're not going to be able to jump all over the place anymore.
So the solution you use, is it undiluted bleach or do you dilute it?
We definitely dilute it. I haven't done it a long time. Marie's staff normally do it. Now they've got the inspection station. I think it's 5%. That they're using it, and we make sure we get lots of small bottles so that we're opening them so that they're fresh when we're opening them, because if it's just sitting on the shelf and there's a small amount and there's a headspace in it, it'll start to degas in the bottle.
I think we can take maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Afterwards, you will all receive a recording of this webinar. And if you reply to it, I will, and if you have any questions that were not answered, I will reach out to Marie and Shelley, and and then I'll ask them the questions in case we can't get to all of them. So we'll try our best to get through a few more if that's okay, Shelley.
Yep.
Okay, so we have, with steelhead populations already in serious decline, do you know if there is any management or monitoring occurring in steelhead waters, particularly in the Skeena region?
Unfortunately, that is a part of the province that Parks Canada doesn't have any responsibility or jurisdiction for. So I don't know what the province of BC is doing right now or what the plans are for that particular location. But I'm sure they're thinking about their susceptible species.
We'll go ahead. I think this will be our last question before we end the webinar. Do you know of any funding that we made available for other groups, i.e. nations, to start collaborative monitoring and prevention programs through the
You froze there for a second, but I think the question was just about if there's funding. I am not totally sure. Parks Canada doesn't have funding that we can give out in that way outside of our jurisdiction, although we have been trying to support indirectly with capacity building. So we've definitely had very early conversations with the Tanaha and the Shuswap, our local Secwepemc band. When we put our sentinel cages out, we will welcome them to come and see what they look like and how to build their own if that's of interest to people. Having said that, I probably would keep an eye on the Environmental Damages Fund. It comes up from time to time, and there's occasionally funding available for different regions if there's been a fine. And sometimes there's criteria for what that money is available for, but that's definitely a place I think people can look as well.
I think that's going to be our last question for today. As we close, I want to again thank Shelley for sharing her expertise in such an engaging and informative way. A recording of this webinar will be posted shortly. A reminder again that you can check out our website, bcinvasives.ca, for all kinds of information, including details on Invasive Species Action Month. And again, you will all be sent a recording of this webinar, and if you reply to it with any other questions, I will get in contact with Shelley and Marie and get you the answers. All right. And with that, enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. And thank you all so much for joining us.